Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. He was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in 2001 and has represented the 31st District since then. He is a retired colonel, having served 28 years in the U.S. Army. He is a proponent for fiscal and social conservatism in the Virginia General Assembly and adheres to the founder's vision of constitutional and conservative government. He is a member of the House Appropriations Committee, Education Committee, and is chairman of the Militia, Police, and Public Safety Committee. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Delegate Scott Lingamfelter.
Don't applaud. I haven't spoken yet. You may not agree with me. So I'm delighted to be here tonight and to welcome you to the Commonwealth of Virginia. We're not very vain people, we Virginians. We are somewhat proud. How many Virginians do we have in here? A few Virginians. Well, as you know, we Virginians believe that everything great about America is Virginia writ large, so we're delighted that you're here and partaking of our hospitality and our very cool weather that we have here. We try to keep the humidity below 200%, and I think we've got it down around, what, 125, somewhere in there. So, in any case, we're delighted to have you here. This is a really wonderful opportunity that you have. And I think that if you look at what is going on in the country today, you are at a place where potentially your leadership, and I say potentially because it is really your choice on what you do as adults, but potentially your leadership may be the generation, it might just be the generation that fixes the mess that my generation has given you. Now I say that, and it seems a bit somber. I'm your keynote speaker. I'm supposed to be witty. I'm supposed to be charming and uplifting, and I'm supposed to be, most of all, brief. And I have good news and bad news in that regard. It has always been my objective to be brief. Unfortunately, I have never been brief. But tonight, I want to try to be brief so that we have an opportunity for questions. Now, this is the first night. Many of you, just now meeting one another. And tonight you get a chance to stand up and embarrass yourself by telling everybody about you, which nobody in their right mind likes to do when you get in these sorts of settings. But this is a time that begins your important week, and so I want to give you some of my thoughts about the challenges that you face. The challenges in many, many ways that have been teed up for you. And I want to talk to you about freedom. Now I notice in your workshops, you will on Friday, I believe, in workshop 2, you will be talking about why our generation should care about freedom. Now, I suspect that at one level, you all care about freedom. The question is, what is your mission in life today? If someone were to say to you, as they said to me many times in the military, what's your mission? And we would frequently say, well, our mission is thus and so. I was a battalion commander. My battalion had a mission. I was an artillery battalion commander, so we had a mission that was to defeat the enemy artillery, and it was always very succinctly stated and so on and so forth. Military has a way to do that, who, what, when, why, and how sort of statement. But the question is, what is your mission? Now, that is apart possibly from the notion of what is your ambition. Two different things. You may have an ambition to go to Georgetown University. I think that's the young man who introduced me would like to go to Georgetown University. I went to the Virginia Military Institute. Anybody interested in going to VMI? If you are, you can see me afterwards. I'm happy to write you a letter of recommendation. I did my master's work at the University of Virginia. But that was an ambition. It was not my mission. And so as I grew into my adult life, it took me a few years to sort out what my mission would be. I always wanted to be a soldier, and I became one. But I lived my life year to year deciding whether or not I would continue to be a soldier. And I did that for about 28 years until I decided, okay, enough is enough. And I would move on and do some other things. But those were ambitions. They really weren't a mission. And so the question that should reside in your head, and I want to get to it, is what is your mission? Let me start the discussion by telling you a story. In 1843, a surviving member of the Revolutionary War was being interviewed by a young Massachusetts scholar. How many of you are from Massachusetts? We have a Massachusetts person. And this young scholar had found a gentleman 50 years his elder, Captain Levi Preston. He was 91 years old, surviving member of the Revolutionary War. And the young scholar said to Captain Preston, "So, you went out to fight the British?" The old gentleman appeared to be somewhat stunned and didn't say anything. He just stood to his full stature, slowly. And the young scholar said somewhat nervously, "Well, you were oppressed." The old gentleman said, "We weren't oppressed." And he said, "Well, you were angry about the tea tax, the Stamp Act." He said, "Never drank a drop of it. The boys threw it in the harbor before we got there." And he said, "Well, what about other taxes?" He said, "Didn't worry about it." In frustration, he said, "Well, you must have read the great works, Locke and Harrington and Sidney, and you cared a lot about freedom, and so you were inspired to fight." He said, "The only books we had were the Bible, Isaac Watts's hymnal, and an almanac." Finally, in frustration, the young scholar said, "Then why did you go out to fight?" And Captain Preston gave these immortal words: "We had always been free, and we intended to stay free always. Always free, free always." And the British, the redcoats, were in our way. It was a very simple mission. Always free, free always. And the redcoats were in our way. Now I want you to think about what it must have been like in 1776. Sometimes when you look at chronologies or books, you begin, 1776. That's the year we began to win our freedom. But you see, our ancestors, our colonists, the revolutionaries, the patriots, never thought themselves enslaved. They never thought themselves anything but free. Remember, we had been here on this continent for nearly 200 years. And to have the notion of the British Parliament all of a sudden to essentially ban representation that colonists believed was theirs to begin with. And Captain Preston, along with so many others, became offended at the notion that somehow they weren't free. They had never thought of themselves as anything but free. And when someone suggested to them that they were not, well, they fought back. And they sustained that freedom. Which brings me to this. The mission that we have before us today is all about freedom. It is all about freedom in winning revolution. And first is they did just that. They fought a revolution and they won it. Well, that's not a particularly difficult thing to do if you have the will to go fight and resist oppression to sustain your freedom. You'll go and fight. But so did the French. And so did the Russians. And so too did the Chinese. And all three of those revolutions failed. And in fact, fell back into a despotic regime that in many ways was worse than what they overthrew in the revolution. But that didn't happen in America. We won our freedom. And what the founders did next, think of it as a triangle, freedom in this corner. What the founders did next was utterly brilliant. Having won revolution, they ordered revolution. And they ordered it with a constitution. Now, every nation has a fundamental constitution. Polybius speaks about it. Other great writers speak about a fundamental constitution, that love thing held in common. It might be something your country produces. It might be some geographical feature of your country. It might be a cultural aspect of your country. But when you look at America and you ask yourself, what is America's love thing held in common? And it's freedom. It's freedom. And the brilliance of the founders is they knew that they had to order that freedom in order for us to have something that we could say is truly our fundamental constitution. I'm going to come back to that in a minute with a notion that Polybius, who wrote in his history, spoke of. But that's the second corner of the triangle. Win revolution and order revolution. But there's a third thing that the founders did that was absolutely decisive, and indeed today is awfully important to you personally. Having won revolution, they ordered it, but they also thought that we must sustain revolution. Notice, not sustain freedom, but sustain revolution. Now, for those of you who have studied Thomas Jefferson, you know that he could be, well, a bit radical now and again. And he was of the mind that sustaining revolution was so important that maybe we just ought to have one every 20 years. Just sort of fix our bayonets and go get the bad guys. Madison and Henry, Patrick Henry, and others of the Commonwealth of Virginia had a slightly different view. They believed that the key to the sustainment of revolution was a frequent recurrence to founding or fundamental principles. A frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. And they thought that was awfully important. There is a gentleman, and this is your homework assignment, so you can write this down. There will be a test afterwards. His name is Os Guinness. His first name is Os. It's an O-S, not O-Z. He isn't the guy behind the curtain. And it's Guinness, kind of like the beer, but you wouldn't know anything about that. G-U-I-N-N-E-S-S. Os Guinness. This is outside the curriculum. You can, your leaders can hold me responsible, but I want every one of you to go to Amazon and order this book. and I want you to read it. And I want you to read it. How many people are going to their senior year this year? How many are going to be juniors this year? How many are going off to college? Okay. Okay, you college guys, if you don't read this, I'm going to come get you with a stick. This is probably one of the most important books you'll read as you prepare for a larger discussion about politics and governance in the country. But what Os Guinness says, and I think he's exactly right, is that the founders were embarrassingly silent about how to do that third corner. They weren't silent about winning revolution. They weren't silent about ordering revolution. But they were embarrassingly silent about how one goes about sustaining revolution. And to a certain extent, I think that they were silent about it because they assumed that we would never be in a place, as many of us believe we are today, where so many of the things that are essential to the sustainment of revolution are now routinely ridiculed by the far left and by the Democratic Party in the United States. So you see this big triangle. I wish I had a board I'd write on it. Winning, ordering, sustaining. It's a big triangle. I want you to go down to this corner of the triangle, though, and I want you to think about a smaller triangle. And that is, how do you sustain revolution? Now, Os Guinness has his formulation. It's not mine. I agree with it. But he talks about a smaller triangle at this corner called the Golden Triangle of Freedom. The Golden Triangle of Freedom. There will be a test. And at one corner of that triangle is the word freedom. And this is what Guinness says. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith of some sort. And faith of any sort, in the context of the American Revolution, requires freedom. So you have freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith. Faith requires freedom. And it's like the recycling triangle without the EPA getting in the way. You can applaud to that. My friend Ken Cuccinelli loves to say, and he is a dear friend of mine, he loves to say that the EPA is the Employment Prevention Agency, which in many ways it is. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith of some sort. Faith of any sort requires freedom. And so goes this triangle of sustaining revolution. And it's vitally important for us to understand that. Now, let me go back to Polybius. I want to talk a little bit about what is the state of sustaining revolution in America today. Well, I have to say, and I think you know them because you sit in class with some of them, that if you were to ask some people of your generation what the three branches of government are, they might say maple, pine, and oak. But one of the things that I would suggest to you is vitally important is civics. And this is a vital component to the sustainment of revolution. But let me talk to you a little bit about this Golden Triangle freedom and where we are. The founders were brilliant in establishing the First Amendment because the First Amendment disestablishes religion. Well, wait a minute. Isn't religion a good thing? Indeed. But the brilliance of the First Amendment was our founders disestablished religion in America. And when they did, religion flourished. And they did this intentionally because they knew that religion would flourish. Because when you are not compelled, you are free to make your own determination, and that is good. And because religion flourishes, so too does virtue, which is awfully important because that's where much of virtue derives, is through faith. And the founders understood that it was not their objective to have a nation of Anglicans. It was their objective to have a nation of people of virtue. Because they knew what? That only a virtuous people are capable of maintaining and sustaining freedom. That if you don't have people who believe in honesty and integrity, that you're in great danger. You know, I think it's Isaiah Berlin, who is a philosopher, a Jewish philosopher actually, in Oxford University, has come up with the notion of positive and negative freedoms. And you know the negative freedoms. Leave my body alone. Leave my guns alone. Leave my property alone. All important. All important notions of my property, my rights, my firearms, my home, my papers. Awfully important. But negative freedoms don't get you there. In order to sustain freedom, you must also focus on what we call positive freedoms. The freedom to do what you are doing today. The freedom to be something. The freedom to do something. The freedom to have an impact in a way that goes beyond yourself. And those things are symbiotic, big word for they work together. And that's what you want. And it's vitally important that if a society, particularly on the positive freedom side of the ledger, is going to be successful, it must have virtue. It must have virtue. And that virtue, of course, derives from faith. And so you have to ask yourself, what is faith in the role of our nation today? And would the founders be comfortable with the notion of just obliterating a discussion of faith from the public domain? And I would submit to you that they would be horrified. And indeed, I think if you read Os Guinness, he would suggest the same thing to you. That indeed, the freedom that we are working out may in fact be unsustainable. Many in your generation are very, very focused on what you would call libertarian politics. And libertarian politics, in many, many ways, focuses on the sustaining of your property and your rights and this sort of negative freedom things. But it may well be a freedom that you are working out that is unsustainable. Because to have true sustained freedom, you must also have the freedom to be something and to do something. And this requires a reinvestment in virtue. Now, I mentioned this fellow Polybius. I'm going to stop boring you here in a minute, and I'm going to let you challenge everything that I've said. But Polybius, in his histories, was quite brilliant, and he talked about a corruption of customs. That many societies have customs, and those customs provide a bedding for that fundamental constitution that we spoke of earlier. In our case, our Constitution. And when that fundamental bedding begins to be tattered and torn and begins to fall apart, so too does that Constitution that crashes to the ground. You're tars. You have associated yourself with the Republican Party. And you are at this point in your life inventorying what that really means for you. What do Republicans really believe? Where do we intend to go in the future? How will we get there? What kind of nation will we be? What kind of people will we be? And the question is, what do you think is the state of that fundamental betting in this country where your Constitution resides? I think it's an open question. And as you go through this week, and you're going to be speaking to people this week that are powerhouses, that are far more brilliant than I'll ever be, and you'll have a challenge, and you'll have an opportunity to challenge their thinking, and to ask them, what do you think is the state of that betting, that betting of customs, of values, of virtue, integrity, honesty? You see, folks, the only legitimate restraint in freedom is self-restraint. And if we don't have the values and the strength to have that self-restraint, our freedom is in trouble. Let me conclude with this thought. Os Guinness is a Christian apologist. Now, this book is not going to turn you into a Christian. This book is about freedom. In fact, the title of the book, it's a great title, A Free People's Suicide, Sustainable Freedom and the American Future. Doesn't that sound really cool? That's something you should really read. He has always been fascinated with the notion of revolution, ordering, and sustaining, and how there is indeed an apologetic dimension to those three areas. If you look at freedom, and you look at the Jews and the Puritans and our revolutionaries, our founders, there's a real parallel. If you look in that first column and you think about revolution, for the Jews, revolution was exodus, leaving Egypt. A lot of people want to leave Egypt these days. Wish Obama would get in it. But leaving Egypt was revolution. For the Puritans, that revolutionary moment was conversion. And for our founders, it was the revolution, the fighting of the revolution with the British. So that second column being ordering, and for the Jewish people, that was covenant. And for the Puritans, it was also covenant. But for our revolutionaries, it was the Constitution. And that third column, sustaining. For the Jews, sustainment is return. And if any of you know about the Jewish faith, you know that one of the key things is the return to Israel, the return to Jerusalem. For the Puritans, it was revival. But for our revolutionaries, it was the sustainment of revolution, the frequent recurrence to founding principles. So we began this discussion with, what is your mission? And let's conclude with it. Your mission is to sustain revolution and Godspeed as you enter that life's work. Thank you very much.